You know all these people, so I'll just give you a terse introduction. Each of our speakers will speak between 5 and 7 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And if they go over, there's no big penalty. Our counsel, Mike Hayes, will be has subpoena power, so that'll be the only thing we have. First, we have Evan Bayh. Round of applause, please. Former senator from the state of Indiana and served on the several committees, and just found out his dad, Birch Bayh, is still alive, 87? 87. Who, and many decades ago, when I was very young, 1968 campaign for president. He was there for Senator Robert Kennedy. Next to him is Carol Browner. Round of applause, please. Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and Senior Counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. You don't look senior in all those things.
I know.
But
or distinguished.
All right, distinguished. Well, we'll find out. Next is Sean McGarvey. Sean is the, round of applause, President of North American Building Trades Union, started his career with the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. Wow, come a long way to the City Club, let me tell you. And next, of course, is a fellow who's been here often, Doug Scott, former chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission. Round of applause. And as we know, the former mayor of the great city of Rockford. So there's our panelists. Senator, this will sound like real innovative, but we'll go in alphabetical order. Why don't you start off 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll just carry on like that.
Well, giving a former United States Senator a microphone is a pretty dangerous thing, so I appreciate your courage in doing that. And it's great to be back in Chicago today, or as we like to say over on our side of the border, back in Greater Indiana, here with all of you today. And I thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I recall, I think, Carol, I was in maybe the Atlanta airport here in the last couple of years, and this fellow I was having a quick bite of lunch at a fast food place, and this guy was looking at me and kept looking at me, and finally he came over to say hello, and he said, "Say, can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "Has anyone ever told you that you are just the spitting image? You look just like Evan Bayh?" And I said, "Well, you know, I hear that quite frequently, actually." And he said, "Boy, if that guy's ever elected president, will you be lucky?" And I said, "You're right." So no cases of mistaken identity here today, and for that I'm very, very grateful. Look, I'll try and stay within my 5 minutes so that we can, I'd really rather have a dialogue here today, because that's really what we're all about with the Nuclear Matters effort. We face some major challenges, both in the United States and here in the great state of Illinois, and it's important that we address these challenges in a thoughtful, intelligent way. And in order to do that, we need to have a dialogue about what the facts are, and so we can assess what is the most appropriate course to meet these challenges going forward. For example, good paying jobs for middle-class families is a major priority for our country today. And it's hard to have a growing economy with expanding businesses that support good paying middle-class jobs without a stable and reliable source of electricity, which you're blessed to have here in Illinois. And that's one of the things that nuclear power does really well. Last year, about this time when we were experiencing, I think it was the polar vortex or snowmageddon, whatever it happened to be called, there were several areas of our country that came very close to having rolling brownouts. Very close. And the fact that nuclear power continued to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of whether the temperature was, 10 degrees, 0, really helped the grid stay active, helped consumers warm their homes, and help businesses stay in business. And so that's a very important attribute that really in the marketplace today is not valued that highly. When we pay for our electricity, it tends to be set by the spot price, the short-term market price on the grid. And the fact that nuclear power is a very reliable, stable source is something that has value to all of us, really is not reflected in the marketplace today. So something to think about. As Sean would tell you, you've got three somewhat vulnerable nuclear plants. You've got a total of 6 here in Illinois. Matter of fact, Illinois leads the nation in zero carbon electricity production. You're #1 in the country, which is a very good and admirable thing, largely because you have nuclear power. It's about 48% of your electricity base load generated here in Illinois, and 90% of your zero carbon power is generated by nuclear facilities, which is great for the environment. It also is good, as I'm sure Sean will remind us, 2,500 people work at the 3 plants that are somewhat vulnerable. They are good paying, middle class jobs, good wages, full benefits. That's a good thing. If those plants close down, as one recently did in Vermont, as one recently did in Wisconsin, one of our neighboring states here, so this is not a theoretical, hypothetical threat. These plants are in peril. Up to 2,500 people would lose their jobs directly, and then there are other indirect employees that would be affected as well. The total economic impact to the state of Illinois would be about $1.8 billion in lower direct economic activity. And if one of the studies, there are a series of studies that your state government has put out, recently concluded, I think, Carol, a total of additional cost to the state because of increases in carbon emissions, which would be a result from even natural gas replacing nuclear, would be about another $9 billion hit to the economy in the state of Illinois. So in any event, these plants are a great resource for you economically, environmentally, as I mentioned, and are important to your state's future. Final thing I'd mention, but it makes this somewhat more topical, and Carol will probably speak to this in greater detail. There are new standards for carbon emissions coming out. Illinois, every state has to adopt a plan by, I think, the middle of next year. You maybe get another a year grace period if you form a coalition with some other states. But you've got to come up with a plan to how to meet new, higher, more stringent standards for the emission of CO2. And so one of the things that we all need to be thinking about here in the room today is if the standards that you have to hit as a state are becoming more stringent, at the very time you might allow some of your non-carbon emitting productive capacity to be taken out, those 3 nuclear plants that are in peril, that's going to make it virtually impossible in the near and immediate term to meet those targets. And that could have additional adverse consequences to the economy of the state of Illinois. So the reason we're here today is to just begin a dialogue about this issue. By the way, I noticed there were some folks demonstrating outside on the way in, and I was tempted to go up to one of them and say, you know, I'm glad you're here, but the mayor's appearing later this week. But didn't want to get Ron mad at me. In any event, it's important that their voice. It's important that all voices be heard. It's important that we deal with the facts, because this is going to have major consequences for your economy, for your consumers, and for our environment. And the nuclear facilities in the state of Illinois play a very important role in all 3 of those things. So having said all that, again, I thank you for your hospitality, and it's great to be back in the Midwest, which for 5 generations of my family has been home.
Wow. Thank you, Evan, and I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to join you today. As you heard, I am Carol Browner, and my current titles appear to have the word senior in them way too often. But I did once have different titles. They've all been kind of funny. I was the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, which means I ran it for 8 years. Nobody really knows what an administrator does. And one time a gentleman was looking to introduce me, and he wanted to note that I was the longest serving administrator of the EPA. But he said, and she's the longest suffering administrator of the EPA. So obviously you've heard of the EPA. Then I had the opportunity to serve your former senator when he first became president, and I was given a very long title, Assistant to the President, which is the highest rank in the White House, Director of the Office of Energy and Policy, Energy and Climate Change Policy. But what I was nicknamed by the press was the Energy Czar. And then someone decided that czar wasn't appropriate, that I was really a czarina. My husband, who Evan knows, did a little bit of research and announced one day when I came home that there were no czarinas in histories without czars. It was all derivative to the female. So that made him the czar and me the czarina. And then the Washington Times, noting my very liberal background, decided that I was a socialist czarina. which, you know, made you wonder what they didn't understand about history. But today, I'm here as a private citizen, and I'm here as a lifelong environmentalist. And probably the question I get asked most often when I talk about nuclear power is, but you're an environmentalist. How could you be pro-nukes? And I will tell you I wasn't always. I sort of had the view that many people had after 3 Mile Island that, you know, we just didn't need nuclear power in our fuel, in our electricity generating. But when I left my 8 years at EPA and before I joined Mr. Obama, I was a private citizen and was looking at energy security from an international perspective and was actually writing an article with a group of people. You've heard of some of them, Madeleine Albright, Dennis McDonough, the current chief of staff to the president, Susan Rice, and we were all debating this issue of energy security. And we started talking about climate change. And that night I was at home and I started thinking, you know what? I can't believe what I believe about climate change, about the dangers of carbon pollution, and take off the table a carbon-free source of energy. It has to be safe, it has to work, but, you know, I really think that greenhouse gas, climate, carbon pollution is the biggest challenge the world faces, and I've been very proud to be a part of efforts to reduce carbon pollution, and it doesn't make sense to me, and particularly right now in the United States, that we would find ourselves in a situation where we're trying hard, and you know the president deserves a lot of credit for really working hard to bend that curve in terms of the levels of carbon pollution. We can't make the hole deeper by taking a source of carbon-free energy off the table. And so for me, it's been sort of an important change in position, but sort of an obvious one. As Evan said, the president, the EPA, is in the process of looking at how to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector. They've already done cars and trucks. There are the first ever greenhouse gas standards have been set on cars and trucks, and now they're focused on the power sector. And they will complete those targets later this year, and then the states have the ability to write a plan. And I give you guys a lot of credit. The report, and what's the name of the report? Someone help me here. That just came out. It's got some complicated name. Anyway, you have the legislature tasked various agencies to generate a report on these issues, and I think they did. I mean, it's a really thoughtful job. They don't really make recommendations, but I think you've got a piece of you've got some good information there off of which people can start to decide what is right for Illinois. Each state will write its own plan. Now, if a state decides to work with another state, which they are free to do, as you're probably aware, the New England states have already been working together on a carbon reduction program. It's called RGGI. But if states decide to work together, EPA is actually going to give them an extra year. And so, you know, as Illinois thinks about what to do, I guess, you know, I would encourage you to think about, can you work with other states to find the most cost-effective, common-sense solutions to driving down carbon pollution, how the nuclear facilities will continue to play an important role so that you're not inadvertently increasing your emissions when you're trying to drive down your emissions. And then I would also say, what is the role of renewables? And what we see in the New England states is they've been able to kind of put the mix together, and maybe that will be another opportunity for you all to learn. But there is tremendous, I think, opportunity for states to really think what's right. And, you know, I'm from Florida, and what's right for Florida may not be right for Illinois. I'm going to finish with a funny story. You guys probably remember Tom DeLay. He was a congressman. He was not particularly fond of EPA. That's probably one way to describe it. Okay. If you don't remember him from the Congress, you might remember him from Dancing with the Stars. He didn't do very well. He quit. But when I was running EPA, he was a member of Congress from Texas. And we got into a public, in a committee hearing, into a debate where Mr. DeLay was raising his voice at me saying, you know, this is 1994, okay? Yes, Al Gore is the vice president. He has written Earth in the Balance, but the science is still emerging on climate change. And Tom is accusing me, Congressman DeLay is accusing me, EPA, of regulating greenhouse gases. And I'm saying, no, we're studying them. We're looking at the science of them. And we go back and forth. And eventually I say, sir, the 1990 Clean Air Act, so it's a relatively new law on the books, doesn't even mention carbon pollution. It doesn't mention greenhouse gases. It doesn't mention climate change. So I don't know if EPA has the authority to regulate carbon pollution, right? EPA has to regulate what Congress has told them to regulate. And he says to me, well, I want you to go do an analysis of the law and come back and tell me if you think you could regulate them. So we've got a bunch of lawyers. They go off. They write a memo, and they conclude that, yes, under the Clean Air Act, if EPA decides that an air pollutant endangers public health and welfare, that EPA must, not can, must regulate it. We, leave office, elections happen, people like me go, we leave the memo sitting there, the state of Massachusetts comes along, picks up the memo, sues in Bush 2, the administration for not regulating greenhouse gases, and lo and behold, they win in the Supreme Court 5-4. The Supreme Court says, the Browner era memo was kind of right, which is EPA has this authority if the science demonstrates an endangerment. So I think it is fair to say that all of these activities that President Obama has been involved in to drive down carbon pollution is in part because of Mr. DeLay. And I suspect that nobody has ever told him he is the proximate cause of why we are in this position today. But I want to just thank Nuclear Matters for inviting us here today, for creating this forum. And I want to end on a note that I do think that we have a lot of tools that will help us address the challenge of climate change. I think it is the essential challenge of our generation. And I do think that nuclear power is an important part of how we will meet that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sean McGarvey. I'm president of North America's Building Trades, neither a former senator or a Czarina, so I will really be brief because I'm anxious to hear if there's a few questions for the panel. North America's Building Trades maintain 95% of all the nuclear generating stations in the United States. We do the refueling, we do the maintenance, we do the upgrades when they upgrade them. We have a workforce that's specially trained to work in these facilities. We have a nuclear mechanics training program that our folks go through to prepare them to go in and work. And we are, not just by my claim, but the most productive, most skilled, safest craft workforce in the world that works in this nuclear industry. And reliability is really important. There's lots of statistics, and folks on this panel are much smarter than I, but the Exelon units in this state lead the way in reliability and delivering, performing at somewhere in the neighborhood of 96% efficiency. The power generation that goes on around the clock, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, is something that drives the economic engine of this region. And I will tell you that from an economic development standpoint, I recently had the opportunity, and I work with a lot of utilities, as you can imagine, to be down in a southern state with a CEO coming out of a meeting with the governor and a mayor of a major American city and the rest of the economic development team who had just closed the deal on two major employers deciding to relocate from an international space into that city and into that region. And one of the compelling arguments for that decision that they ultimately made was the ability to know that there was long-term predictability of cost and power generation to feed their enterprise there, that they had the CEO of the power company as part of that economic development team. So when you think about, decisions that people might have to make about whether or not to take this baseload generation offline in this state, it's something else that really needs to be considered, the long-term economic impact to the state and the state's ability to continue to grow its economy by attracting the kind of industries and businesses that create those middle-class jobs that the people I'm fortunate enough to represent currently have. So it doesn't just affect the people that are operating those facilities. It doesn't just affect the shareholders of those companies. It affects the future opportunities for people to have real middle-class jobs that are connected to those facilities, because there's that predictability of round-the-clock base load generation that's safe, and the added benefit of its 60% or it's 90% of the meeting the thresholds on clean energy in the state of Illinois. When we go into these state plans later, the impact, I don't even know how you measure it if you take them offline, what you would have to do to make up that difference in that. And at the end of the day, you know, I have had the opportunity long ago in my career to do a survey where I actually had to travel over a 4-day period all across southern Illinois. And I won't bore you with the details, but it was kind of like with a clipboard, and I had to determine it was over jurisdiction, which is a thing with the building trades. And I can tell you that all those small towns I went to, some were prospering. Some of those counties were prospering, and some were not. Some were boarded up, and some were nothing was happening. And the reason for that, as I could determine through my travels, was whatever the major industry was in that town or that county had moved up, had packed up and gone away. And what was left was not pretty. And when you think about what these facilities in the state of Illinois generate in school taxes, in economic development in that county where they're located, in the jobs, in the restaurants, supporting the police force, the fire department. On top of that, the charitable giving that they do. And then the support of the boys clubs and the girls clubs and the baseball teams and the churches. The economic impact of these facilities as an anchor industry in these areas of the state are hugely important. So there's a lot of ramifications to long-term economic stability in an area when you make a decision to take a premier employer who pays real middle-class wages, treats its workforce right, pays its taxes on time, operates a safe enterprise in the state, follows all the rules and regs. Before a decision is made, this legislature, this new governor, and these leaders in this room should make sure they have the maximum impact on a thoughtful discussion before that is, because the ramifications long-term are really not good if we take that base load generation offline. Yankees coming down, it's devastating that area where that plant's coming down. If you don't believe me, take a trip up there and see what's going on. It's not good for that state. It's not good for that area, that whole regional area up there. So these are important, almost public trust entities, these generating facilities in the state of Illinois. So, you know, we want to have a rational, reasonable discussion. We want to make sure that people recognize all the attributes of affordable, clean power in the 21st century, and that before hasty decisions are made, or people that don't really understand, you know, the long-term ramifications of what happens when you make a decision, because it's not like you shut a switch off. Once you take it down, I can tell you, because we're building a couple right now, what it takes to build a new nuclear power plant in this country, the type of investment it takes. I'm building 2 new units in Waynesboro County, Georgia. It's a $14 billion investment. And I can tell you, for the company that's building it, it dominates their balance sheet. So if you don't think there's risk for the investors, risk for the leadership of that company to make a decision and then try to get something built on time within that budget and make the returns necessary, once you take them down, you're not going to hit a switch and start them back up and go. It's a big deal. So we're huge supporters. We understand everything that goes into maintaining this fleet, and we encourage, like I said, a rational, reasonable discussion on the best policy for it to make sure, you know, the long-term economic development of not just this state but this region with those units before they go away. Thanks.
Thanks to the City Club. It's great to be back here again. I think this is about my 7th or 8th time addressing you. This is the first time I've ever done it when I'm unemployed, though, so I really appreciate the chance to come back today because the lunch was tremendous. So, and I'm actually just picturing Administrator Browner Tom DeLay somewhere just having lunch with a raging case of indigestion and doesn't know why. So, so that was a great story. I appreciate it. And you know, there's a lot that I think we'll end up agreeing on as we get into the discussions, because all of these decisions end up getting filtered through when you're at a Commerce Commission or when you're at the Environmental Protection Agency, as I was for 5 years here in Illinois. Everything gets filtered through the same themes that you've been hearing: safe, affordable, reliable electricity, environmental compliance with that as well, the jobs, the economy. And Illinois has actually spent a fair amount of time over the last several years working on all of those issues and trying to think about what our energy future looks like, not just our mix today, but what's our energy future going to look like, how are we going to comply with the environmental laws that we know are coming, or even things like trying to work on things like what it is in the future. What's our energy mix going to look like in the future? Because the line that we always had at the ICC was what our energy mix will look like in the future. Now it's about a little less than half nuclear power, about 40% coal, a little bit of gas, and then renewables. And all that we know is it's probably not going to look just like that in 2030. So all of these discussions and all of these decisions, Sean's exactly right, they call for really thoughtful, detailed kinds of discussions that involve not just nuclear power, but more broadly, because every decision you make in the power industry affects every other piece of the power industry. So it's important for us to, I'm off again. It's important for us to, can I switch with you, Sean? Sure. Thank you. So it's important for us to consider all of these things as we go forward. So I'm going to do a couple of things here. I want to talk a little bit about both the environmental compliance that's been mentioned and also the nuclear resolution that came from the House last year. The report, by the way, is entitled "The Potential Nuclear Power Plant Closings in Illinois, Impacts and Market-Based Solutions," which is a mouthful, you're right. So, but it is available through all of the different websites from the agencies that put that together: the Illinois Power Agency, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, the Illinois Commerce Commission, and the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. So that came to us, the House passed that resolution back at the end of last year's session in May, with the idea of saying, look, there's this potential that's out there that 3 plants in Illinois might close. What would the impact of that be? And if the legislature decided that that wasn't something, that they didn't like the impacts of that, what would be some market-based solutions to try to overcome that? And so that's what the report seeks to do. It's about 300 pages long. I do recommend it, though, because it is a very good primer, I think, on how energy works in Illinois, how the whole system of energy works, all of the interconnected and interrelated pieces of that. But I think there are a few takeaways. I'm going to do these very briefly. We can get into it a little bit more as we go forward. But the first thing is that it's extremely complicated. As Sean said, you know, it calls for a very thoughtful discussion, and that's absolutely true. Because it's not just about the nuclear industry here in Illinois. It's very important to us for all of the reasons that have been stated, not just from the jobs, the environmental, reliable source of base load power. All of those things are very, very important to us. But when we do something in a market-based attempt to try to help the nuclear industry out, what effect does that have on all of the other power generators in the state, some of whom are challenged as well? And Sean's stories about the communities where nuclear power plants live, if you do the jobs I've done for the last 9 years, you'll learn very quickly and hear about the impact of coal plants in different communities throughout the whole state of Illinois. No less important to their particular communities than the nuclear plants are to theirs. So this whole idea that it's very complicated and interrelated, I think, is one that we need to pay attention to. The second thing is this discussion gets going in earnest probably very shortly in the next couple weeks or so, is that assumptions and modeling and what you put into the whole modeling discussion, the assumptions that you put into that will really play a huge impact on the result. For example, if you're talking about environmental impacts, if you assume that all of the nuclear power would be replaced by coal, there's a huge environmental impact to that. If you assume that it'll be replaced by gas, there's a lesser environmental impact. If you assume that there's a good portion of that that can be made up through energy efficiency, or through renewable resources or through demand response or some of the other things that are at the disposal of the power grids, then the environmental impact becomes much less. And so all of those assumptions become very important to it. The same is true with jobs. When you're trying to figure out what the impact is of jobs, I recommend to you the Department of Commerce's section of that report, where you see that depending on the assumptions that you make, you could have either a huge job impact and a huge economic impact, or one that's actually very small, depending on what you replace this power source with. So again, the assumptions that go into that are very, very important. And that there are a number of other factors that are kind of outside of the control of state government that will also play into this that are very important as well. The regional markets and rules. I remember getting a question here and Paul Green trying to interpret what the heck the question was the last time I spoke here that talked about how the regional markets function. We don't have nearly enough time for that today, but Illinois is in two different regional markets. They have different sets of rules. They have different sets of what they pay for capacity, in other words, to make sure that power will be there when folks need it. Those rules, those market-based rules that those two different organizations have a huge impact on what the cost is of power here in Chicago, downstate, and other places as well. The environmental impacts and climate regulations, as were mentioned, not just the Clean Power Plan or the ones to reduce greenhouse gases, but also to reduce other pollutants that have come from the EPA very recently. Things like reducing the impact of coal ash. All of that plays on how many coal plants will actually stay in operation here in the state. What are commodity prices? If we'd been having this discussion 10 years ago, 8 years ago, we would have had a very different picture of natural gas prices than we do today because of hydraulic fracturing, and we all know that debate going on here in Illinois, but there isn't any doubt that has dramatically affected the pricing of electricity here in this state and other places throughout the country. And so what commodity prices does plays into this in a huge way as well. And investment decisions that choose to get made by others, whether they're transmission lines to be built, pipelines for gas, or other power plant generation decisions like Sean was talking with building new nuclear plants, and technology improvements. You know, again, hydraulic fracturing is a good example of that because that fundamentally changed the way we think of energy in this country. But if we start to think about things like energy storage and what that might do for renewable energy coming online, again, another game changer that will fundamentally affect how the state is able to, and this region and the country are able to operate. And then economic factors. A large portion of greenhouse gases were reduced between 2005 and 2012, 12 being the base year that EPA is using for their rule, because of the recession. That people were just using less electricity, and so there are those economic impacts that not necessarily at control of the Illinois legislature. And so the other part that we were asked to do, the four agencies, was to make suggestions as to market-based solutions, and that can include everything from doing nothing and just letting the markets take care of that, to everything from some of the topics that I can actually utter in public now that I'm not working for the state anymore, things like carbon tax and cap and trade and all of those things that you've heard about for a long period of time that are actually our market-based solutions, have been used in other environmental reduction programs before for things like acid rain and others, and have worked very well around the country. Or things like a clean energy standard or a sustainable power planning standard. All of those different, the layout of those different ways to try to accomplish this, and there are more than that, but those are the ones that are focused on in the report, are all out there. And so it does call for that kind of detailed discussion that Sean was talking about. I think the idea is that the debate needs to be about more than the nuclear plants. And I'm not downplaying the impact of the nuclear plants. I think they're very important, and I've been a supporter of nuclear energy personally for a number of years, and I am, because it is a safe, low-cost, reliable source of carbon-free electricity. And so it's something that, being the largest nuclear fleet in the country, is something that we have to take very seriously here. But I think that the debate, as we start to look at how we're going to comply with the new Clean Power Plan that the feds have put out, and we've been doing a lot of work on that, the state has, working not just in Illinois, but with other states as well. We've been working in a 14-state, multi-state approach to try to see if it makes sense to do some kind of larger market-based solutions to this. Directionally, I think the evidence is that it does make sense to start looking at those things. But to do that, you have to set up trading platforms and do some other things that will reward those folks who are putting out carbon-free electricity, and probably at the expense of those who aren't. And so you have to set up some kind of a market-based solution for that. I think the good news is that we've gotten a good start on that, both through the work that we've done in the state and through the report. So it really lays it out, I think, well for the legislators and others. And actually, I'm very much looking forward to how that debate unfolds this year, and look forward to your questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand, and one of our crack team will pick it up. So you got to write it out, sir. This is the City Club of Chicago. We don't have an oral tradition. How's that? Remember, this is where Barack, where he got to start. So. Also, if you want to ask a question, you got to sign your name. Got a lot of new people here, Mr. Doherty. We have to, Sergeant of Armed Department, did you deal with this? All right, here we go. Ed Miller, Joyce Foundation. In Illinois, do you foresee the nuclear industry throwing its weight behind a low carbon standard that is good for renewable and energy efficiency at the expense of coal, or the nuclear and coal generation standing together to fend off competition from new power sources? Just jump in, 25 words or less. Pass it down. You gotta.
Well, not being from Illinois.
Thanks, Carol.
All you political science students, government at work.
I think the short answer is I'm not sure. I think if you look at Exelon and their approach, and I know they have folks here today, so it'd be a good question to ask them, Ed, as well. But because I'm kind of curious myself. But if you look at, they have supported kind of the trading platforms and the multi-state trading platforms, whether it was Waxman Markey or other iterations of that as a company, they've supported that. And so I can see some kind of support for either a clean energy standard or a trading platform that presumably might involve more states than Illinois, and they don't have to be contiguous as well. One thing I'll say about that, the multi-state group is important because just about all the states that are in that room really hate the idea of the Clean Power Plan. They really dislike the idea of the rule, either from a states' rights standpoint, from an economic standpoint, whether it's just we don't want Washington telling us what to do, but they're in the room because they have to make a recommendation at some point to their governor or their legislators, assuming that Carol's memo holds up and the courts will reaffirm their ability to regulate carbon. They've got to try to make the best recommendation of what's going to make the most sense for their state economically, and that may involve multi-state and trading programs. And so I can see the nuclear industry here being very supportive of that because it would do a couple of things. One, it would support their short-term needs that they have, as have been pointed out here today, but also help set us up for the kind of trading program in the future that might be very supportive of that. Coal industry, you've seen a couple of announcements here where they've talked about either taking some plants offline, which may be necessary for the state to meet their Clean Power Plan compliance, or of switching to alternative fuel, maybe coal to gas, something like that. And so I think you're going to see that discussion continue to play out there. I don't necessarily know that I'll see any great alignment between the coal and the nuclear industry as well on this, because their interests here and in other states are very different. But
okay,
again,
Doug, we got questions here.
Yeah, it's all
You're
right.
not in government anymore. No need to filibuster. No need. All right.
It's always a need to filibuster, Paul.
All right. We have. I got the word. We got to cut. We need really a lot of short answers. Here we go. Bob, is it Kelter, from the Environmental Law and Policy Center? This is for you, Ms. Browner. Do you support
The answer is yes.
Thank you very much. Well,
You said you needed short answers.
sure you don't want to move to Illinois and run for office? Okay. Do you support the production tax credit for renewables?
I do.
There you go. All right. Maureen, is that Headington?
Wait, but maybe we should tell people what it is.
All right, if you want to go on, go ahead.
We have a long history in the U.S. of supporting nascent industries that started with in the energy space with the oil industry back actually in I think 1916, 1918. Some of those benefits remain today. Obviously, there's been support of the nuclear industry through various things, including the loan guarantee, which President Obama made to the facility you are building in Georgia or helped organize. For the wind and solar, there have been various tax credits. They have not been embraced. What's the best way to say it? Congress has not sort of put them in place over the long term. They've sort of been fits and starts. But it is certainly these various tax credits have been hugely important to making both wind and solar cost competitive with other forms of energy, and I do support them. Okay, we got the word that some of these folks have to catch planes, and there's no reason why we shouldn't leave on a controversial note. Maureen Headington, where are you there? Maureen? Back there, okay. You ready for this one? And by the way, all four of you, I'm sure you'll both want to jump up and answer this one. Exelon is asking our state legislature to provide hundreds of millions of dollars to subsidize its fleet of Illinois nuclear plants. Why should Illinois taxpayers be compelled to subsidize an industry that is too risky for Wall Street? That's a City Club question. Anyone?
I'll comment. Recently, the state of Tennessee invested $600 million in the expansion of a Volkswagen manufacturing facility that's going to have about 800 jobs attached to it. The original investment in tax credits, all kinds of infrastructure, everything else, the original package for the original one was somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 million. So that's about $1.5 billion for that facility in Tennessee that is going to have about somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 jobs, and those jobs are going to pay on average of $35,000 a year in Tennessee. So I would say that every state in the country is competing to attract business to their state, and that if those states are willing to throw around those kinds of dollars for those kinds of jobs, which, by the way, in my book, $35,000 is not a middle-class job, okay? So I don't think it was a good investment on the state of Tennessee's part. So I think it's wholly appropriate, okay, for states with mature businesses to look for ways to keep them viable up to and including helping to invest in them. If you look at when the bailout of the car industry, when we're in the middle of that depression, turned out to be a pretty good investment by the federal government. It was a pretty smart move to keep manufacturing afloat in this country. So I think it's wholly appropriate, again, from a business perspective, for the long-term viability of economic development and the middle class in the state of Illinois, for state legislatures and the governor to look real hard at where they invest their dollars. I think it'd be a good investment.
Anyone else want to jump in, Mr. Browner? No?
I'll say the question comes down to the conversation about what is the reliable source of power that you can have and where are you best spending those dollars. And so the determination needs to be a whole analysis of if you put that money into a different source of power, for example, what are the job impacts of that? What are the reliability impacts of that? You may come up with a different answer, and I don't think that that's been done yet. And so I think that needs to be part of the discussion going forward to find what's the most reliable source we've got going forward in order to comply with the plan and what provides us the power at the least possible cost.
And I would add one other thing to your list of what you have to consider,
Sure.
which is the environmental impacts.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
You know, I think that, and in fact, I was interested that the report actually includes a societal cost of carbon emissions. So it actually took into account the fact that when we put pollution into the air, that has ramifications, that has costs associated with it, and I applaud the report for doing that.
I apologize to the other, there were a lot of good questions, but some of these folks are on a very tight time schedule. How about a big round of applause for our